It's an absolute pleasure to introduce James Courtney. James is a professor in psychology, and actually I'm going to hand it over to you, James. Please, can you tell us what you do?
Certainly, Sinead. I'm a clinical psychologist. I work in an academic setting at a major university. In that setting, I work with trauma particularly, and I teach and supervise clinicians, emerging psychologists, if you like, in the proper way to treat trauma with a very specific focus on occupational trauma, so people who have chronic exposure to trauma, but other forms of trauma as well that we'll talk about today.
Definitely. Let me tell you how James and I met. We are currently in Delhi, in India. We are both speaking at the 8th Asian Conference for Cognitive Behavior Therapy, and yesterday I actually chaired James's keynote lecture, and I thought I have to invite James to my channel because he gives such wonderful information. So thank you for being here, James.
Pleasure.
How common is trauma?
Trauma is actually very common. So the world statistics here are, would you believe, that 50 to 70% of people witness or experience a trauma that what we term is a potentially traumatic event. Now what that means is it's a potentially traumatic to you, might not be traumatic to me, and so forth. For different people, trauma is very individual, of course, but people see trauma and it is very common, depending on where you live and some other variables there. But yeah, so I mean, people can experience, as you say, through war zones, through civil unrest, but also people experience trauma in everyday life and in family settings, and also through institutional abuse, for example. What we tend to think about when we say the term trauma is a car accident or a single event where somebody is hurt, or unfortunately an assault or a sexual assault as a one-off event. That's actually not as common. People more commonly endure multiple traumas and multiple exposures to traumas. And going back to my area of focus particularly, think about police and ambulance firefighters who see traumas every day when they go to work. That's part of their life. That's going to happen. They know before they go to work that they're going to see horrific things that you and I would not see as a part of our lives.
That is so right. And James and I were having a discussion that it is recognized that in certain professions you do end up seeing a little bit more trauma. You expect it, and there is help for it if needed. But there are other forms of subtle trauma like exclusion at work, or isolation or loneliness because of being not for certain reasons, or bullying or harassment at work, and wondered where, how much of an impact that kind of trauma has on an individual's brain.
Unfortunately, it's an area that we're seeing more and more. So organisational trauma in the management type setting or a system setting where people are put in situations of bullying, harassment, pressure. We know that people who experience high levels of responsibility with low levels of authority is a particularly good recipe for stress, right?
Yes,
so,
absolutely.
We see people being, I guess, literally abused in the workplace and put in positions where they have no power, and that endures across time. They may not have the ability to get out of those roles for various reasons. They might want to be in those roles, but we see organisational trauma, if you want to call it that, and very unfortunate outcomes, and we are seeing more and more of that as people disclose that and talk about it in a system sort of setting.
I was quite bowled over by the statistic of 50 to 70%, James. I told you that. And often we find that people may not recognize that they have been impacted by the trauma. So James, what are the common ways that people experience trauma and present?
There's a core set of symptoms that are very common. Essentially, people become very anxious and experience emotional dysregulation, so become very emotionally upset at times. And this plays out through your whole body. We know that, okay, this is a mental health issue, but people experience horrible things in their bodies as well. So stomach pain, neck pain, loss of bladder or even bowel control, vomiting, changes in being able to eat and dietary habits and so forth. We see avoidance, patterns of avoidance, which are very, very strong, avoiding triggers, as we call them, or reminders of particular places, events and settings. One of the core symptoms that is very problematic for people, of course, is unwanted reminders or images in their brains.
Yeah.
So flashbacks, things called dissociation, where people actually feel like they're actually back at the traumatic event, at the place where the event took place. There's some of the very common ones. What we then see is a symptom called hypervigilance, where people become very, very aware of the surroundings around them, of people around them, and again, avoidance is key here. The hypervigilance, the anxiety, the very symptoms lead people to avoid. They actually prefer to stay home and not go out at all, not answer phones, not answer the door. If they do go out, they're prone to experiencing all these horrible symptoms. If people are out in a public setting, such as a restaurant or a cafe, if they can even do that, they'll sit with their back to the wall and monitor people coming and going and exits and so forth, and may not be able to tolerate that sort of setting for very long at all.
And sometimes it can lead to panic attacks as well, isn't it? And
absolutely,
loss of confidence, and become lonely for that reason, because they don't want to meet friends or go out, and it can have an all-round impact on their social, personal and professional life. And sometimes it's such a slow decline that people don't realize
it becomes the new norm, essentially.
Absolutely.
And what this plays to then is what we call negative cognitions, is a formal term, but essentially mood and the way we think about the world, about other people, and how you think about yourself. Now, one of the very important symptoms that we see commonly is sleep disruption and total sleep disruption. So people can't get to sleep, they can't stay asleep, and they have horrific nightmares. And that's an area that we really need to target as well when we're working with people with PTSD.
That's true, and sometimes people just present with sleep problems without realizing, and then when you do the work, you realize that there's a trauma behind it.
Exactly, that's a very good point. I think, you know, that we see people from different, they enter the system in different ways, so they come and see us in different ways. Another area, yes, sleep is one where we may see people and we find that there's a traumatic background there, is memory and concentration.
True.
So people will often present to other services such as neurologists or neuropsychologists thinking they've got dementia, because one of the core features here is in fact a really big problem with memory and concentration. And they're often screened and say, no, that's actually okay, what you've got is PTSD. It's a core issue.
And that's particularly because there's a brain science behind trauma, that trauma does affect changes in the brain. And of course, if you want to know what these changes look like, please do go to the trauma series on this YouTube channel at Videos by Dr. Shania. There's a whole trauma series, and one of the videos is brain science behind trauma, where I do explain what changes happen in the brain when individuals are exposed to such trauma. Tell us about repeated trauma.
Repeated trauma is probably being ignored in some of our diagnostic thinking and our diagnostic frameworks for many, many years, even though we know it went on. So repeated trauma has come out now to be termed complex trauma. Now, you and I both worked in this field for a while, and we knew that there was complex trauma and repeated trauma. We didn't have a way of capturing it. So when we talk about repeated trauma, we think about trauma again in perhaps children who are physically or sexually abused in a family setting over years, and they have little opportunity, or no opportunity essentially to escape, and no power over what's going on. Again, this can be also inflicted from organisations, from different organisational and institutional settings. Refugee populations are another example here. I also believe that, as I mentioned before, police, ambulance, fire and so forth, that's an enduring form of trauma. And there's a number of predictors here where people unfortunately do get exposed to more than one form of trauma, or more than one trauma. We see that having one traumatic event is actually predictive of having more, would you believe?
Really?
So,
why is that?
It seems to set up some vulnerabilities in people. So if we look at the children that may have been abused, unfortunately, across childhood, that actually can change their development, of course, and set them up to be vulnerable to more traumas, put them in settings, whether it's socioeconomic or other psychological changes, which actually make them more vulnerable to ongoing trauma, very unfortunately. So it is very common for people to be...
So therefore detecting early is so important.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
And the statistic here is that it's very common for people to have more than 3 major traumas.
Right, so really important to pick up after, well,
Yes.
actually not have the trauma, but if somebody's experiencing trauma. And we were discussing, James, that for the first time in a diagnostic system, that's the International Classification of Diseases 11, complex post-traumatic stress disorder is a diagnostic category, which sometimes, having a diagnosis is unhelpful, but sometimes it's helpful in terms of validating what is happening, but also accessing treatments. So, while there are pros and cons of diagnosis, I'm quite delighted that complex post-traumatic stress disorder has been validated as a category, so individuals can recognize, yes, this is happening to me and I need to seek treatment. And what would you say are the key features of complex PTSD?
Complex PTSD has all of the core features of PTSD. In fact, that's one of the requirements. So the types of symptoms we've already talked about, but there's also some additional features. People have problems managing emotions. It's called emotional lability, but essentially emotional regulation. If people are triggered and get upset very easily, they find it very hard to resettle and to resettle from that. Relationship management and relationships with other people can be very problematic. Now that could be friends, it could be intimate relationships, and social connection generally can be very much affected. And a very important one is self-identity and concept of self, and feeling very, if you like, worthless and very poor about your own self and inner self.
And you described it really well. In individuals have been through that kind of repeated trauma, this sense of powerlessness or helplessness becomes quite a big thing, right?
Yes, but it's also normalised because that is the person.
Yes.
And that's normal for them now.
So that's become the new norm, and it becomes their personality.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So, of course, if you recognize any of these symptoms, you must seek help. There are treatments available. And James, what are the evidence-based treatments that are currently available for trauma and C-PTSD or complex post-traumatic stress disorder?
One of the ways that we can treat complex PTSD is through our traditional mechanisms of treatment for PTSD, which is targeting the memories and unhelpful memories, distressing memories essentially of an event. The techniques that we use there is we use exposure techniques, where we actually take people back through the events in a very graduated and controlled manner in clinical sessions, and do repeated revisits, if you like. We call that processing the memory, and there's some science around how that works. There's other techniques called EMDR, which is an eye movement technique, which is also focusing on memories. And there's another technique called in vivo exposure, which means we take people out to settings and help them manage the anxiety and the avoidance around those settings. Now, the other ways of treating here are that we actually target some of the core symptoms associated with complex PTSD that we identified before, such as the emotional dysregulation. So targeting people's inability to recover from emotional upset, if you like, and the relationship and self-identity sort of symptoms. Now, some people argue we should do that first and settle or stabilise people before targeting the actual traumatic memories, whereas others say no, we should target the trauma very directly and work with these with the other symptoms concurrently. So a little bit of disagreement in the field, but I think we're getting somewhere with that. The other complexity here, if you like, in treating this is, as you well know, there's a very high amount of comorbid disorders. So we see more than one disorder. So 80% of people with PTSD have another mental health disorder, and 50% have up to 3 or more additional disorders. So it is a complex area for treatment, which is why it's important to seek out people who are well trained in the field.
Yeah, absolutely. I would always say, because so much is going on, I would say that this is between the professional and the patient to sit down and identify what are your priorities, what areas do you want to address first, what does recovery mean to you, and then set some goals of recovery and how to work through them. So having a very personalized approach, would you agree?
Absolutely. The person-centered care model is I think the way forward, which is, it is not for us to say what recovery is for a person. We need to discuss that with the person, identify, as you say, the goals for therapy, and we come up with a treatment plan with that person. And some of the techniques I was talking about, some of the treatments, we can talk about that with the person in an informed way, and so this is how we can go about it. These symptoms, these challenges seem to be playing out for you particularly, and come up with a treatment plan here.
Absolutely. What can they do? 3 top tips on what they can do to improve the quality of their lives.
Certainly. I think 3 things to be very careful of is, number 1, sleep. As you know, anyone that sleeps a short period of hours, short amount of hours with disruptions, feels awful. We know that PTSD is associated with poor sleep. Try and work on your sleep. Now, that's easy to say, but there is some very good advice in the public domain on that.
So have a good sleep hygiene,
Good
right?
sleep hygiene.
Wake up on time, sleep on time, have a sleep routine, no tea,
Yes.
coffee, the usual stuff about
how
sleep
to
hygiene.
get back to sleep during the night if you do wake up and so forth. There's some common elements there. Watch out for substance use. So alcohol is very commonly used to treat the symptoms of PTSD, but I can assure you that in the long term, even in the short term, it doesn't help. It maintains some of the mood issues and the negative mood things that we see. It does actually muck up your sleep. Might help you get to sleep, but it doesn't help any of the rest of your sleep cycle, which is a bit like a washing machine in different cycles throughout the night. It disturbs those. So be very careful about the amount of substances people are using. If you're using a lot of alcohol to treat symptoms, that's not going to be helpful at all. And physical exercise. We know that physical exercise is highly beneficial for mental health and physical health, of course.
All around.
And that's highly recommended again to continue to engage in exercise that you find that you have access to, even if it's walking or even if it's fast walking, whatever you're able to achieve.
And of course, seek help if you are having these problems. So please join me in thanking Professor Courtney. It's been a privilege to have you here.
Thank you, Shana.
And if you've enjoyed it, please subscribe to the channel, like it, share it, tell it to all the people you know. Thank you for watching.